to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Greetings, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the God Conclusion. Today, we have as our guest David Bentley. And David and I have corresponded a bit in private messages, got a very interesting life going. Before I go any further, I do want to say congratulations on the birth of your newest child.
Thank you.
We were actually communicating in Facebook when your wife went into labor, I do believe,
Yeah,
and you were going to the hospital.
Conversation.
Yeah. But now things have settled down a little bit, and we got the opportunity to speak. And David confided in me. I hope you don't mind me informing the audience that he considered himself a Christian for most of his adult life, and now he has revised his worldview to more of a position of agnosticism. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say so.
Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Okay. To give a little bit of a history on where I come from with the background, I wasn't raised in a super religious household, but I did have pretty religious family members. So I went to church camp early on at 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. I got saved at church camp. And then a couple years later, decided that I would have my uncle, who was actually a preacher. I would like to have him baptize me. And so I was 13 or 14 years old. My uncle baptized me. I was still going to church camp pretty often. And my grandparents that was on that side of the family, that's my dad's brother, my uncle that I'm referring to, with those grandparents, every time I was around them, we would go to church, and we had the big family Easter gathering, stuff like that. On my mom's side of the family, the religious practices wasn't as present, just more of an accepted view of things. My mom ended up getting divorced from my father before I was a couple years old even, and she ended up later on marrying a man who, his family was Jewish. He wasn't a practicing Jew or anything. I never went to temple or anything like that. But that was the household of my mother and him. And there was no talk or discussion of spiritualness or God or Jesus or anything like that present in that household whatsoever. Anything that I learned from that was from my uncle, the pastor, my grandparents, and from going to church camp. And I would say up until my 20s, because I skipped over. It wasn't until my mother was diagnosed with cancer that she really got religious and went to church, found God, found Jesus. Not that she was or wasn't a believer before. I honestly can't say. In many ways, I wish that me and my mother had a little bit deeper relationship, but she was young when she was pregnant with me. She was 15 when she was pregnant, and she turned 16. Actually, she was 15 when I was born. She turned 16 the year that I was born, but I was after I was born. And my grandmother was the one that really took the role as my mom for a lot of years. And it was just crazy, mixed up back and forth with the whole family, the split family and the grandparents on both sides. And everybody thought that David Bentley was going to be the most specialist baby in the world. So I definitely feel like they probably helped develop some grand delusions of grandeur in there for me somewhere, because I think I thought that something amazing was going to happen in life. Turns out I'm just normal like everybody else. But
that doesn't mean you're not special too.
Right. We're all special. Honestly, it's a miracle that anybody's here.
Amen to that.
Life is mind-blowing to me. It wasn't until then that I really started looking into what all that was. Then my son was conceived, and the year that my son was born, my mom died. My mom died in February. My son was born in July. 4 or 5 months there. She never got to see her first grandbaby, any of her grandbabies. That would have been her first one, and she didn't get to see him before she died. And this all happening in my life through the course of along the road, there was times when me and my mom had fought. I ended up getting in a fist fight with my stepdad. I got kicked out of the house. I tried hard drugs for the first time when I was 14 years old because I was out of the house. I ended up getting thrown out of the house again later for drugs. Went to live at my grandparents' house. Sold drugs, involved in a lifestyle that I never really had any. Nobody has any business being in. But it's not like I was. It's not like I was born into that lifestyle or anything. I lived in a mediocre, average American neighborhood, had the same opportunity anybody else could have had. I just decided to go a different route. You know what I mean? But amidst all this, my mom's cancer and everything, she starts going to church. Church becomes very prevalent in her life before she dies. At some point or another, she tells me that she saw Jesus, and Jesus is going to heal her of cancer. At 16, 17 years old, I took that to heart to mean that my mom would not die from cancer. Now, my uncle would tell me later, he said, Jesus did take your mother's cancer away. She's in heaven and she doesn't have cancer anymore. And you know what? If you're looking at that from the theological and the biblical point of view, you're 1,000% correct. And maybe it doesn't sit, and it did at some point. There's been times where some of those things that I've heard and been said to me like that, it might hit me different. But now where I stand, I feel some type of way about it. I do. I've just contemplated and I've heard these things in my mind over these years, among other things, that this spiritual journey for me since my mom died. You got to be careful. Sometimes you might have to reel me in because I'll go off on a rabbit trail. I've been telling myself all day, prepping myself not to do this. My mother dies of cancer and I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what any of that was, what to do with myself, why she was dead, why a woman like that would get cancer. As far as I knew, disease was brought into the world because of sin, and you get what you sow, right? You do bad things and God punishes you, and then of course, now later on I found out that's not the way that things work. Obviously, at this age, where I was at this stage, I was struggling with this, and I fought with this, and I cursed at God, and I yelled at God, and I hated God, and I was mad at God, and then I thought I'd side with the enemy. I thought I might look into the mysticisms and the witchcrafts, and if there is a devil, let's see what he has to offer, because God ain't working out for me. And I thought I'd try to sell my soul to the devil. I wouldn't say that I dove really deep far into that
Oh,
stuff.
that's pretty deep, David.
And it,
That's pretty
yeah,
deep.
I guess it's heavy for where I was, but I'm saying as far as like getting into the practice and the knowledge or the understanding of demonology and everything, I did get into it some, but not as deep as some might maybe. And maybe that was maybe God, maybe it was Jesus, maybe it was all that protecting me, keeping me from going deeper than I could have. I don't know. I'm still on the fence with it. Because I'm not. That's why it's the Gnosticism, and that's why it's been in the last couple of weeks that I've been able to really solidify myself as that. There's been times where I looked into Christian Gnosticism and thought maybe, and I feel like I can. That's been a big struggle for me all this time. Is, well, people say, like you asked me, are you Christian? Are you this? Are you a Baptist? Are you a Pentecostal? Are you simply? Are you this? Are you that? And it's been that with the labels since I remember when I was getting ready to go into high school. My sister asking me, my stepsister, Todd's daughter, asking me, little neat note. My stepsister's name is Davy. I'm David. David. We're both named after our grandparents, David, but those parents didn't know each other at all. It's just a weird coincidence. But I could use confirmation bias, and I could say that the universe brought that together, and that there's some kind of mystical meaning there. But I'm sorry. So
This is an interesting conversation. And I'm going to jump in real quick for just a second, just to throw some terms out there because we've used the term agnostic. And the classic, I think it's the Greek definition of the term is I don't know. And
right,
from my
yes,
perspective, everybody on earth is an agnostic by default because
I
anybody that claims knowledge is insane. I believe that God exists. I am 99.999. You can carry that out as far as you want. I'm that sure that God exists, but I'm not 100%. I don't know that God exists to the point where I can prove it to you.
right.
So I have to claim myself as being agnostic by default, but so are you, and so is everyone else. So it's a term that really has no meaning. To me, the terms that have meaning are you are a theist, you are an atheist, or you are an apathetic agnostic, which means you're a fence sitter. And there's nothing wrong with that if you don't have enough information to make a more informed decision. But there's not a multitude of positions. And by default, no one can claim real knowledge. And that's just my opinion.
Yeah.
So, with that being said, go ahead with your story. It's
Okay.
fascinating.
So everybody tells me I need to write a book, man.
You
So
probably do at some point, but you
I've said
probably
I'm
don't
doing
have
it a couple
time right
times.
now.
As I begin to okay. So during all that, man, it was crazy, especially during the gonna sell my soul era. I was also homeless, so to speak. I had a place to sleep. I was living in a pop-up camper at a flea market, but
Well,
nevertheless, I was
that qualifies as basically homeless.
yeah, it was something else living out there, and the drug use was in and out. That's when I was really first strongly introduced to psychedelics. I had done used psychedelics in the past, only mushrooms. I'd tried mushrooms in the past with psilocybin and didn't really get any effects. But during the period that I was homeless there, so living at the flea market, I did try psychedelics for the first time. And I'll say that LSD was a mind blower for me because I felt like whatever people feel when I see these people at these get super spiritual and have these moments and everything like that where and I've seen them at church, these big gatherings, what have you. I could feel like where I could relate to that, and maybe there's something that there is spiritual that can happen from the force otherwise. But whatever this was, this connection, I felt different after my experience with LSD, and I've only experienced it a couple other times, and it definitely made me
I'm
look at
sorry
the
for
world different.
laughing, but
No,
but
that's okay. That's okay. It made me look at the world different. I can't really explain it if you haven't experienced that. And since then,
let me interject again and say my whole deal is I'm not a Christian evangelist. I'm not an apologist. I'm a writer. I wrote a book. I'm marketing the book, and I'm a normal guy, just like you. I did not go to seminary. I'm not a theologian by any stretch of the imagination. And so when I start laughing, when you start talking about your psychedelic experiences, I'm relating to you, my friend. I was in the seventh row at the Fox Theater, center aisle, for the Grateful Dead when Jerry Garcia was still alive. It was 1978. They had just come out with the album Shakedown Street, and they were promoting that. And that was a religious experience, particularly if you had just dropped acid, as I had done before the show. It was definitely, so it's not something I would do today, of course, but I say that. I have to think about it, but it's been a long time and I haven't had the opportunity. But you can have religious experiences and you can accelerate them. I'm not advocating the use of mind altering drugs, but I am saying you can have a religious experience under the influence of a mind altering drug. There is no doubt about that. And it
but
can be very profound.
and I agree, and I've come to that conclusion myself. But under every school of thought that I've been, at least here in the Bible Belt, under every school of thought that I've been, and even what I've deeply studied myself, this would be considered lies from the devil. That there's no way that I could have a true mind-opening, religious, spiritual experience that was some kind of brought on by others by some kind of intoxicating substance whatsoever it might be. That, and if I did, it was a lie from the devil. And
Well, now we can debate the authenticity of the quote unquote religious experience that is achieved by the use of hallucinogens. I'm not advocating for it by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just telling you, I know exactly what you're talking about
right,
from personal experience. And it's not something that I brag about. I've never talked about it in this kind of a setting because it's not something that I'm advocating for. But I'm a firm believer in honesty. And if I have to be brutally honest, I have to admit that's part of my past, that's part of my history. And now I have had what was in my mind clearly a religious and intense religious experience with the risen Christ. And we can talk about that some if you want. And the people that listen to this who were skeptics will say, you just had an acid flashback 15 years after I dropped acid.
Mm,
I'm not
not
thinking that's
not
what it
likely.
was.
Yeah, not
And how my profound and intense religious experience happened was not an accident, it was an invitation. But I don't want to get off of the track of you telling us your story first.
okay.
So
Because let's get to where we'll get to where I got today. I'm trying to get us there. I guess due to having those experiences and then being told that there's no way for me to have experienced that and it be real, say the authenticity of it, man. Then I'm like, what's the difference between my experience and an experience that you have? And that's where I began to realize that. And I'm jumping way ahead actually. Before I got to there, I really dug deep into the Bible. Even after the first LSD experience, I went through some things, and I ended up having a little interesting part of the story is that I have 5 children, 3 different mothers, and while during the homeless thing, right as I was getting my stuff together, I met a girl and I had a child. And because of the situation that I was in, she obviously wasn't going to stay around for that and left and took her and my daughter went to with back to her mother. And my daughter was born out of state away from me. I didn't meet her for several years, but during all this transitioning and these things happening, I was getting help periodically from family members and stuff like that. I ended up staying at my aunt's house, my aunt Carolyn, who I love dearly. I love her to death. She's very super spiritual, and she opened up her home to me. God bless her, and she done a lot for me in that short period of time. And it was actually her son that owned the flea market that I was staying at. And so she let me stay there at her house for a little period of time. And I started going to church with her. Things didn't work out with where I was with staying with her just because I still wanted to go out and run around and act a fool and shouldn't have been because I was living in my aunt's house. And that's basically what she ended up telling me. If you want to go out and do these things, you're not going to be able to stay here, which of course that takes tough love. And it took a lot of tough love for me to actually finally ever get my crap all the way together, which is how honestly I got to where I am. And I'll say that a huge piece of my testimony, which like I told you, if you'd have talked to me a year ago, I was 1,000% positive that there was no other way but this way. That there was no. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, the light. The only way to the Father is through me, and no one comes to the Father but he who the Father calls. Nobody comes to me through the Father who calls them." So somewhere along the way, I started to just be like, okay, I got another baby born out of here in another state, and I need to try to do something and reel myself in and get this together. I'm in my 20s now, somewhere 25, 27 in that range. Yeah, exactly that range. I'd have been exactly 25 or no, I guess I'd have been 20. Dang, my daughter is 9 years old and I'm 37. So I'd have been 28. I was actually probably way older than I should have been. I'm digging and learning scripture, going in and out of church a little bit here and there. I end up getting back on my feet, and I end up getting a house and starting a little lawn mowing business for myself, get my feet under me, and then everything took a turn for the worst again. I was doing really well, and then just I don't know, decided not to self sabotage. It seems to be something that I do, and I just went off on the deep end and started really partying and lost control of everything and I began to lose my customers and and this has all been a key part of my testimony to the fact that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for God. I couldn't be where I was today if it wasn't for Christ coming into my life, because all of these things taking place, it would seem like Romans 8:28, which is actually quoted right here in this. These are my vows to my wife. Romans 8:28 said, "All things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose." And all realizing under this and all of this understanding, it began to make sense to me. But And even when I was on my own, as I was starting to mess up, because there was actually a girl I started dating that me and her quit dating because I started to get really into my Bible again. When my oldest son was born, my oldest son will be 15 in July. When he was born, I took him down to the altar and said, God, I don't know how to raise a boy. Take him, make him yours. And I will say this, that boy is a straight A student athlete, and I probably couldn't have done that on my own. So I don't know, but I'm messing up. I end up losing everything. My customers, I end up telling my customers, I'm like, every now and then I'm calling my customers and I'm like, hey, I'm just having equipment failure. I'll make it next week. The equipment failure was me because I'm coming off being high for 3 days or who knows what, and I can't get my stuff together. So I end up losing everything. I'm losing my house. I'm losing my customers. I lose my truck. I end up going to jail, and my truck gets repoed because I can't make my truck payment. So I'm out of a house, out of money, out of equipment, out of everything. And my uncle, the one that baptized me, all those years ago, I reach out to him and I ask him if I could sleep on his couch for a week or two because I still had a lawnmower left. I had a push mower left. So I was like, I'm gonna bring my lawnmower over to your house and mow a couple yards, get some money saved up, and then my plan was to hitchhike to Missouri because in Missouri the Strange Music headquarters are there, and I was going to go and stand outside the Strange Music headquarters and freestyle rap until Tech Nine signed me to a record label, and then that would be my success story, and it would all make sense or whatever. And that was crazy. And my uncle said, that's nuts. You're probably going to die doing that. So why don't you just come to my house and get a job? That sounded like something that a high person would say. I was like, all right. He said, why don't you just come to my house and get a job and come to church? And I said, okay. I was like, all right. So I come over and I stayed at his house for a little while, and I ended up smoking weed with this guy that I worked with for a while. I got a job real quick. Like day 2, I had a job. I ain't got no problem finding work. So I smoked weed with this guy after work one day, and I come to my uncle's house, and he's like, what's going on with you? And I was like, sorry, uncle, man, I smoked a little weed today after work. And he was like, you know the rules. I told you can't do that if you're gonna stay at my house. So you're gonna have to get your things and you're gonna have to leave. And I was like, all right. He said, but hold on, I got this. I got a different option though. I was like, what is that? He said, I got this rehab you can go to, and it's called a Teen Challenge. And I was like, no, I'm not doing that. And he was like, it's actually called Adult Teen Challenge. You just started off as Teen Challenge. And I was like, not doing that. That's crazy. I went and I stayed at some girl's house and was at her house and started looking up YouTube videos on this Adult Teen Challenge place, right? It's a Pentecostal Assembly of God faith-based ministry. I had never been a part of any kind of Pentecostal stuff. I knew about it, but I'd never really been to any revivals or anything like that, not Pentecostal wise. I started looking into it, and here I am. I'm like, it's either the streets or this place, and this place is going to give me a bed, and they're going to feed me. And the whole idea of their program is, at the end of their program, you go in it for a year, and at the end of their program, they help you get a job and get you back on your feet, and you start saving up money, and while still staying at the program and having some accountability. So I'm like, you know what? I'll go for it. So I do, and I go. I end up doing a little bit more than a year for the actual program because I didn't always follow the rules. So that tacked on time. So I ended up staying a little bit longer. But then afterwards, I wanted to go back and volunteer in the program, and I did for some period of time. And when that came to an end, I went. I was that was it. My time's done, and with still nowhere to go. I'm still basically in the same place I was a year and a half ago. Only now I'm sober. You know what I mean? Still no place to go or anything. So I call my grandma up in Oklahoma, which is where I live now, and she lets me stay at her house for a while. I get a job. I save up I save up money, get a place, buy a vehicle. I get my son to come live with me. My son comes and lives with me. I meet my wife through some crazy circumstances with my son needing a tutor. And this is now we're in the last 3 years of my life because me and my wife our second anniversary will be no, 6/26, 6/26, 21 will be, or 23 will be 2 years. 6/21 was our year we got married. I barely even known my wife, and I'll be honest, the way she came into my life, it was all seeming just orchestrated plan, this divine orchestrated plan by God. And through all this, my studying brought me to I began to study like hardcore theologians like R.C. Sproul and John MacArthur, Bodhi Bachman. I don't know if any of these names
I
meaning.
know all of them.
Okay, and so I grabbed on to the Reformed theology with all my might. In fact, this is one of my favorite books, and I'm not even read all of it yet. And it's R.C. Sproul, Shall Live by Faith. It's a commentary of the entire book of Romans. I have another book. I have all kinds of books over here. I thought about talking to you about some of them. I've read like God's Crime Scene, which is
J.
great.
Warner Wallace.
Yep. That book changed my life. The Jesus Among Other Gods by Ravi Zacharias. Mind blowing. I was hurt when all the scandal stuff came out about Ravi, but hey, I get it. Men are men. Men are gonna fail you every time. I'm with all that, and I don't know, man. Somewhere in this, and for a while, as I really gripped onto Reformed theology, and I began to understand the sovereignty of God and what the Bible was truly teaching, and first, number one, began to understand that most of the churches are not teaching biblical philosophy. They're so far off. And number two, if that's the case, I began to struggle with that. There's no which way that you flip and look at it. Everybody doesn't have the same opportunity. Like even when you study, like a good example I'll use, and this was one of my favorite sermons actually by RC when he preaches on Joseph being thrown into the pit. And one of the things that I used to say that from Joseph being thrown to the pit to Jesus being nailed on the cross, you see the sovereign God at work. And when Joseph's brothers showed up after they're like, oh, he's gonna kill us, he's for sure gonna cast us out. And Joseph's brothers, he said to them, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, so that many here would live that would have died otherwise. So it does show and preach that God definitely is at work in his creation, actively at work in his creation. And I see that. I see what that's saying there and what it's teaching, because if Joseph not been thrown into the pit by his brothers and had not been sold into slavery, then he would have not ended up in Potiphar's house, would have not been interpreted the dreams, would have not ended up Pharaoh's right-hand man, would have not been the man that was overseeing the treasures of Egypt, which means the Jews would have never sojourned to Egypt, which would have mean that you would have never needed Moses. So all of these things are orchestrated out. And it's like, man, when you start to zoom out and you look at this grand mosaic, you see this amazing author at work, and it's mind blowing. And I was captivated by this, by Reformed theology, and understanding this and accepting this. It broke my heart for humanity. It broke my heart for the church because of how much church is wrong. And then I began to struggle with because up to this point, like I said, so much of my background still told me that if it's not of God, basically it's of the devil. And like I said, these spiritual experiences, anything that I've had, anything kind of spiritual experience I've had outside of praying to Jesus has been a lie. And then I start to see that some of these preachers and some of these churches are also preaching things that aren't from the Bible. They're not in the Bible. These things that they say and do and imply aren't biblical. They're not what the Bible teaches. So are they being compelled by the devil to now I'm plagued by a world of false teachers. I went hard into down that road too, because then I started looking at all the what's the big guy from Houston? Everybody loved Joel Osteen's.
Oh boy, that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, you start going and I start seeing, but then even on a smaller scale.
Do you know what I call Joel Osteen?
What?
He's a prosperity pimp.
Oh, for sure. There's a lot of those.
He's not preaching the gospel. He's not preaching Christianity. He cherry picks a positive message that gets people to give him money. It is the most cynical, unchristian ministry on the planet, in my opinion. Okay. I am not a fan of
So
Joel
does that
Osteen.
mean that every single person that has been under his ministry has believed a lie and now they don't get to go to heaven?
I don't know. I can't make that kind of a statement. You're asking me to express the wisdom of God. And I'm sure that there are people that go to Joel Osteen's church or listen to his message that also read the Bible and on some level know that he's not preaching the real Bible.
It is. But on all of it, and see, that's a whole nother subject for me too, honestly. Like, it seems that we like to cherry pick which things we're gonna say are so bad. God gave there's thousands of laws, and like the homosexuality is one that we love to really pick on that one. And that's, of course, they would have back then too, because it was weird and obscure to them. And look, it's weird to me too, and it's definitely not biologically suitable. But I'm just saying, who are we to like make these such scornful judgments on these people? Recently, I got into a really heated discussion with a very close friend and his wife, because look, I'm going to be very open. I'm an open book. I don't like to hide anything. And plus, I live in Oklahoma anyway. It's a medical marijuana state, and I'm a medical marijuana user. I'm a huge advocate for a structured. There's a difference just with anything. You can eat too many potato chips, and it's bad for you. But in any sense, we were having this argument about this situation, and I love them both, and I don't mean any ill towards them at all, but I'm sitting there with them partaking in this, and they're talking to me about homosexuality and how homosexuals can't be members of churches and this and that. And I'm like, because I know that from a church point of view, that partaking in marijuana is also sinful and scornful. In fact, I was once a church leader, and I stepped down because at the end of the day, my conscience did eat at me, because I felt like I'm allowing my pastor and my leader to believe something about me, even though we never directly had the conversation. I knew that ultimately in his heart and mind, he believed that I was a completely reformed, sober person. I do believe that I'm sober. I don't use drugs. I don't drink, and I'm not, so I do consider myself sober. I don't think that that's the more rabbit trails and other subjects. But my point is, I was having this discussion with them, and as they're telling me this, and I'm like, what if your church knew what you were doing right now? How would they feel about it? I was like, you wouldn't be in the positions that you are in church. And they were like, no, we wouldn't. And I'm like, exactly. But it's okay because you're hiding it. So now it's different. It's okay. And then again, we're so now, and even at that, I don't agree with that necessarily. I don't think that a guy shouldn't be able to drive the bus ministry at church because he smokes marijuana. I don't think that's a bad thing. That wasn't my ministry. I'm just using examples. And I realize you get into a gray area because there's a lot of cultural issues there. But again, when you start looking at the history of humanity and the culture and the way that we've shaped the views of certain things in the past, especially the past 100 years in the history of America, what they've done with this war on drugs and everything is just, it's a mind warp. And what's to say that the advent of religion wasn't also just the same thing? How easy to get everybody in control and act how you want them to act, because Sky Dad's up there watching, and even though you can't see him, he's going to smite you every time see all these earthquakes happen because y'all don't know how to act. And it just, I mean, it's somewhere along the way it started to transform into that to me, and I was like, man, it just seems like that's what it is for people. Is let's take what happens, and then we'll say, oh, that's because of God. We'll already have our conclusion, and then we'll take everything that else happens and we'll make it make sense with this, instead of saying, look at the world around us, look at all the things that have happened and took place, and that's why I came to the conclusion where I'm like, where I just don't know. And I'm not saying that there's not a God. My view, if anything, I lean on the creation side of things, because it is hard for me to look out into the universe, even as wild as the universe is, but also as amazing as it is, and as vast and as big as it is. And just the fact that any planet sits where it sits in the Goldilocks zone of its sun, and the capability for life to be established in those parameters, is a working miracle to me. And it would seem that it would need some kind of consciousness at play. Even if you look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, if you say, oh, it's all evolution, okay, but it would seem that evolution had some sort of goal, that it was trying to reach a point. There wasn't, like, obviously it seemed like it was trying to get somewhere. The goal wasn't to just randomly have things happen. If that was the case, we'd have like arms growing out of the side of our head and weird stuff. But you don't see that orchestration design. I'm with that.
My friend, you're preaching to the choir.
So I struggle. My struggle is just that simply when it comes to a worldview, saying this is the one and only God, and the one and only way that it can be is this one way, and there is no other option. That's it.
So that's where your agnosticism comes in. It's not that whether there is any sort of God, it's whether the Christian God is the only way to reach heaven. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Heaven or whatever you like. I know that. And see, for me, I think heaven isn't, it's been called nirvana, lots of other things, this place of enlightenment, if you will. I don't think that the Christian view of heaven is that we're all going to die and be there in this new body, probably bald with no fingernails because death can't be there and there's dead cells in there. And it's this, and we're all just going to be there in white robes worshiping holy, or that's actually the biblical painted view, or the accepted worldview of it is that we're all going to be reunited with our loved ones and we're going to be like forever having a big, nice barbecue with Jesus and there's going to be no sin there. And I think that both of those views are just a little bit, I think it's beautiful to look at. I think that one of them isn't biblical, none whatsoever, and the other one is the biblical view. I don't know. I just don't know if I believe that's the way it is. I don't know if that's just what I believe. That's what it is.
That's fair enough. And I'll be the first to tell you, when I read the Bible, I struggle with it. I don't believe in cherry picking. And when you get to a hard section, you really have to dig in and try to understand what is being said there, because the Bible is a very complex book. The atheists like to mock and ridicule and say it was written by a bunch of illiterate sheep herders 2,000 years ago that didn't know what they were talking about. And
Yep.
that's ridiculous because there is what I would describe as supernatural wisdom in the Bible. I'm
There's
gonna
mind-blowing stuff.
I'm gonna take a couple minutes and I'm gonna say a few things because you've given me a lot to unpack.
Yeah,
And,
yeah. I feel like it for a while.
and I just like to speak my mind for a few minutes. I understand completely the residual elements of doubt of, was Jesus, when I had my crisis of faith, I was about the same age you are now. I had gone to college. I had slid from early young earth creationism beliefs to a much more secular view of a universe that was created by the Big Bang in billions of years. And about the only part, ironically, that I never really accepted from that secular worldview was the idea that, as Darwin famously said, that monkeys make men. I can believe in a world, in a universe that was created by God roughly about the same time that the young earth creationists say that it was, because there is some evidence that supports that worldview. However, I describe myself as earth age agnostic because I don't know how old the earth is. And I look at the other side and I see that they do all these experiments and they come out with estimations that the earth is 4 billion years old and the universe is 15 billion years old, give or take. And I go, I don't know. I wasn't there 10,000 years ago or 4 billion years ago. So it's not for me to say with any sort of conviction what's the truth.
Right.
I just look at the evidence, I make a decision, I come back to it later. As more information comes in, I might revise my worldview. And God knows I have gone from young earth creationist to what I would call apathetic agnostic. And then for many years, I was an old earth creationist and I mocked young earth creationism. Not mocked, but I wasn't sympathetic to it. But then I watched a movie called Is Genesis History, I believe is the name of it.
I haven't
And
watched that one yet, but I saw
it is fascinating because it is all science based. And it makes a very compelling argument that Genesis is true and that the earth and the universe may not be as old as some of our tests say that they are. And I retreat to the position of I don't know. All I know is this: when I was an apathetic agnostic, or what I prefer to think of as I was mostly a serious materialist, and I only cared about making money. And I had a good job. I was a software developer. I had the opportunity to travel the world. I didn't need God in my life. But then I got married. I had a family almost immediately, or I did have a family immediately because my wife had a daughter from her first marriage. And then we had a child. So I felt compelled to take the family to church, but I didn't really want to because Sunday was my day to sleep in. I usually worked 6 days a week back then. And again, I was obsessed with making money, climbing the ladder, the corporate ladder, increasing my intake or my place on the food chain. And one night I decided that if God didn't exist, I didn't want to go to church anymore. I didn't want to go through the motions to hedge my bets and say, if God doesn't exist, I don't want to be wasting my time. And I was thinking, Jesus could not be real. Santa Claus isn't real. I know Santa Claus isn't real because I am Santa Claus to my own children. So the Easter Bunny is not real. Is Jesus any more real than they were? This is a story that happened 2,000 years ago. And I remember distinctly having the thought, what if this was the most incredible, overarching hoax in the history of man? What if none of this is true? And I had grown up in the church and gone to Sunday school and all that kind of stuff. And I had been forced during confirmation classes to memorize certain Bible verses. And two verses popped into my head and I connected the dots between them. Those verses are Matthew 7:7, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. Revelation 3:20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If you open the door, I'm coming in. So I spent that night, I said, if you exist, you can prove it. I'm open. Come in. I'm begging for it. And I was convinced as I'm doing this that I'm going to fall asleep and I'm going to wake up an atheist and move forward with my life. That's why I say now, every time, always be careful what you ask for because you just might get it. And what happened to me changed my life entirely. That next morning, I woke up and I was just as sure as you're sitting there, right there, talking to me, that Jesus had come into my bedroom, Yeshua had come into my bedroom the night before and lit it up like it was the sun. And to this day, this is 30 years later, I still get some feelings of emotion thinking about the power of that moment. And then I think about how stupid could you be? Because I also grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and I had experiences with the paranormal for years. And I believed in ghosts and I didn't even believe in God. And to me, that's totally incompatible thinking. If you are an atheist, you should be a strict materialist. You should be a monist. You should not believe in duality of body and spirit.
Right.
But the problem is there is evidence, and it's clear evidence that says that the body and the spirit, the brain and the mind are separable entities. There's once I started down that rabbit hole of research, I mean, for years after I had my profound religious experience, it didn't change anything. I was still a software developer. I didn't write books. I didn't have any interest in writing a book. And then one night, Richard Dawkins is on television and he said a sentence that changed my life. He said, cars and computers and cell phones are all intelligently designed, but the human body is not. And
Yeah,
I couldn't believe that somebody that intelligent would say something that foolish, but I didn't have any scientific evidence to support my beliefs. So that started me in doing research and that started me writing books and that got me to the point where we are today here having this conversation. And what I'm hearing is You're not an agnostic in the sense of you don't know whether or not God exists. You are only agnostic as to whether or not Jesus is who he claimed to be.
And I feel like, okay, if I take my ESV Reformed Bible right over there off my bookshelf, I feel like what's in that Bible is those theologians and scholars' best interpretation to take what left we do have of all of those authorships and give their best presentation of what was said in those things based on the knowledge that they have. I believe definitely that Yeshua Christ walked the planet. I believe that something obviously happened because it divided time. Whether you can call it the common era now if you want to. What made it the common era? Something major happened, and it said, hey, it was major enough to say that now from this point on, we're just starting a whole new calendar, a whole new date set. Something huge had to have taken place. There, part of me has been like, and it's not even so much so that it's been a hoax. I guess I've struggled with. Okay, so I've been down to the Branch Davidian, the David Koresh place. There was actually a young man that was in the rehab with me that was sent there from that place. And I learned so much about that stuff. And that happened when I was 10 or 11 years old. So I remember hearing about it as an adolescent coming up. And then when I got older, I looked into it a little bit. But somewhere in probably in the last 10 years, I'd say I really started re-looking at that. And then Netflix, I didn't even watch that Netflix documentary recently. I did start it. But my point is, you've still got all of these people from that, all of these leftover people that are powerfully moved from that still. And this following left from it. And if you were to take that scenario and put it 2,000 years ago, it would have definitely, and because that's basically what happened, was there was this big movement happening. The government said, oh no, we're not going to have it. And they came in and shut it down and killed the leader and his followers. Okay, but let's go back and let's say this happens 2,000 years ago. First of all, humans in their way of thinking was definitely going to be vastly different. But the government sees this uprising coming. Pilate, Herod, all of them, they shut it down. We ain't gonna have it. We're gonna have these people rising up. They ain't gonna think they got a leader. We're not gonna have it. Shut it down. So they do. They kill their leader. Now you got all these guys up here. They're sitting up there in this room, locked up and scared. And one of them's got some balls, and one of them says, "You know what, man? We can't let this guy's death be in vain. This would be horrible." And then what if they just really now? Then, of course, I've done this with myself too. I guess if I was that guy, I wouldn't have taken it as far as Peter did and be willing to get stoned to death and crucified upside down for it. I feel, because that was a part of my long time. I considered myself probably a Christian apologetics for a long time. And that was a big point for me to make, is that why would these men have taken this to death? Why be a martyr for something that you knew wasn't ultimately the truth?
That's the same question I asked myself that night.
How do we know for sure that's even what happened to those guys? All of that's been.
Oh, we have documented records outside of the Bible. In fact, none of the records of what happened to the disciples are in the Bible.
Yeah, no, but it's all church documented.
No,
right?
It's historical records. It's historical records. Here's the deal. We can talk about whether there is merit in other religions. And I understand the pull of everybody else can't be wrong and we've only got the right solution. I quote from Buddha. I find value in some of the things that he said, but Jesus was different than everybody else that's ever been on this planet.
That's
and
true.
There's no doubt about that, because the impact that he had. David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, they're almost a footnote in history, and we're still in the lifetime of that event happening. He was a false messiah, and he created a cult. Now, did they deserve to die? I don't think that was. I think that the government definitely did a lot of wrong things there, but I don't know enough of the details to speak on that. But it's nothing like what the first Christians were, because not only were the disciples all martyred except for John, Many early Christians were tortured to death and martyred for their faith,
Nero
and
used to write charges.
they didn't even meet Jesus. They only knew of him by reputation and the stories that people told that did know Jesus. Paul, people will argue that Jesus may or may not have existed. There are some atheists that will argue the Jesus mythicist scenario, but nobody ever questions whether Paul existed. And the reason is that we have countless documents that support the life of Paul. The thing is, Paul isn't Paul without the road to Damascus, without that profound, that same experience that happened to me in my bedroom happened to Paul on the road to Damascus. And it changed his life to the point where he went from killing people to supporting them and dying with them. So, to me, the evidence that Jesus was who he said he was is almost beyond dispute. Even Bart Ehrman, who is an agnostic and he's a historian, I think it's North Carolina or Duke, but he's written a number of books and he says there's better evidence that Jesus Christ lived than Julius Caesar lived. There's
Right.
just better evidence.
I
And
would agree. I would agree.
but then again, there is a divide in his mind where he just cannot bring himself to accept that the miracles of Jesus and the things that made Jesus so profound of a historical figure, he disputes them all. He rejects them. And I don't understand the logic of that because he's not a stupid man, but his arguments are dumb, in
Yeah.
my
What,
opinion.
what was that guy's name again?
Bart Ehrman.
Bart Ehrman. Who do you, there's a guy that wrote the Jesus hoax. If you're that's a no, that one's a really bad
That
read.
might have been Robert Price, and then there's another guy named Richard Carrier,
Yeah, the
and
Robert Price is
they're all six of one,
it,
half dozen of the
those
other.
they
They
and they
all have
read
the same
really really
basic.
hard. I will say that it's really hard. You have a harder time trying to take away from any of that than you do trying to present with the evidence that it all happened. I guess it's just been a struggle for me lately. Like I say, I don't really know why, what the struggle is, but it's just
Let me
and
finish the thought because we talk about Jesus. There are only really three other major religions. There's Hindu, and there's Judaism, and there's Islam. Islam and Judaism both acknowledge Jesus as the historical figure. They
Mhm.
both deny his divinity, but all major religions except for Hinduism, I don't think they have a belief on Jesus per se.
No.
But all the other major religions, Jesus is a central figure in their belief system. They don't all agree on his significance, but they all acknowledge him. And
Yeah. And I will say there's like from that and even from like Ravi's book that I read, you have this huge shift in difference between from in Judaism, in Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. Everything is all about something that a person needs to do to reach this state of heaven, nirvana, enlightenment, what have you. Whereas versus in the Bible with Christianity, you have Christ who comes to you. And I understand all of this deep, and I got chills just saying that just now. It's weird, but it's see,
can I interrupt you again and
yeah,
just say a couple of things that are on my heart and in my mind? And I'm not just saying this to flatter you or anything like that, but you're given your life story and your history, your background. And I listen to you now and I hear a very bright and very articulate man who is going through some personal struggles with his faith at the moment, but that's natural. But I hear somebody who's gifted. And I don't know, I've never said these words. I'm 60, almost 63 years old. Never said these words to anybody in my life. But I'm going to say them to you now. I think you have a gift that you need to be using. And you are, in my opinion, the future of the church because you're honest. You'll tell people the truth. You'll tell them, I was broken. I was a drug addict. I was homeless. That's a powerful message. Joel Osteen is a snake in human clothing. He's as oily as they can be. There is nothing real about that man. But when I hear you speaking, I hear something that's genuine and real. And you're just being honest with me and you're telling me that you've got these doubts, but I don't really hear a lot of doubt. I hear confusion. I don't really hear much doubt. Now I'll let you speak again.
Yeah, you might be right. I really appreciate you saying something like that. That means a lot. I have felt like if there was a time when I thought that I was going to be a preacher.
I think still think that time is coming.
And me too.
You can't just start tomorrow. You have to go to seminary. You have to go get some sort of formal training.
I
But
started taking some seminary classes through online Hillsdale College. They offer some free classes.
get back
And,
to it. I don't. I'm going out on a limb here, and I don't ever do this, but I felt compelled to say that to you because I
that's
hear you, and I all I'm hearing is honesty and genuine feelings and emotion, and that's what people need today. They don't need, oh, you just give me enough money and everything's going to be right in your life and you'll live your best life now. That makes me want to vomit when I hear
me too.
that. This life, I don't care how many planes you've got, I don't care how big your house is, Joel Osteen. This ain't going to be the best life you could possibly have. So that I'm going to get off my high horse here and stop berating you to go to
You might
seminary,
have just
but
done something. This might maybe all of this was God working all this. Maybe he did something to bring all this together. Because I'll tell you, man, hearing that, especially coming from you, man, this being the first time we've ever been face to face, it really hit for me, man. Because something I didn't say apart during that time when I was at that rehab, during the faith based rehab, they give you an opportunity. They give every at some point you'll have an opportunity to go to a choir and sing for a church. And because the church is that's how this ministry stays alive, obviously, and men go and give their testimonies at these churches, different various churches all across the state. And of course, Teen Challenge is a nationwide ministry, and it does change lives. If anybody needed help you ever find out about, I would turn them in that direction. In any sense, I was doing this one time where I was giving my testimony and up there speaking, and there was a woman afterwards that came up to me and she said something along those lines to me, and I didn't really know how to take it. I was like, okay. And then later on, maybe, and like I said, because there was a period where I was like, maybe that really meant something, and I'm gonna do this. And I was so gung ho, and even when me and my wife got married, and I wanted so bad to be a huge active member in the church, and I don't know, man. This whole time I've struggled with it all, and stepping down out of that leadership position that I was in church, it hurt. I ain't gonna lie, it hurt. And it was a big blow to me. And during that period, while I was during that leadership and position in church, I started preaching. And I actually preached this sermon at a camp trip. So my position specifically was the leader of the Royal Rangers, the basically Boy Scouts for the Assembly of God. And I was the Royal Rangers camp leader. And I took the kids camping, and their fathers came out, and I preached a message on the armor of God. And my pastor actually told my wife later that was one of the most powerful messages he's ever heard. And
you've already got experience.
I don't know, man. I don't know what it's been lately, but I'm glad that we talked. I'm about to go all crazy. I'm emotional sometimes, so excuse me for a second. But yeah, maybe I'm supposed to be a preacher, man.
It's just a seed, the sower parable. I just threw the seed out there and I'm just going to keep walking. And if the seed takes root, if you feel called after this conversation is over, I would pray that you would look into that more seriously because I'm telling you, I'd come to your church if I lived in Oklahoma. I'd come to your church and hear you preach because you are a very eloquent and it's a very natural it's conversational. The pastor that whose church I belonged to for most of my adult life here in Atlanta, he was a Catholic priest who came to Miami, was counseling his wife who was Jewish, and they fell in love. They got married. He left the Catholic Church. He was like a roofer or something like that in Florida, and then went back to seminary and became a Lutheran pastor. And he would just come out. He didn't preach from the pulpit. He'd come and stand in the first couple of rows, and he just talk. And it's very much like hearing you talk, except for he had an Irish accent. And so if you feel compelled, you've heard this message before, you told me, and I planted that seed again, and just see if it takes root. Yeah, I can tell you have a passion for seeking the truth. And I will tell you, I don't know if you can find truth in other religions, but I do know that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. I have no doubt about that. And that's a message that this world needs to hear more than ever.
Yeah.
I couldn't do what I'm telling you to do because A, I'm too old. B, my sins, as great as yours are, I'm not talking about them because mine are greater. I can almost guarantee you because I got more mileage on the tires. I'm not bragging about this. I'm just telling you
I know.
that we are all called to do different things. And when I hear you speak, I hear the voice of somebody that needs to be heard. And that's all I'm going to say.
Man, I really appreciate that. I really do. This might be a game changer for everything, man.
I will say prayers that you are guided in the right direction, not just because I told you to. That's a suggestion that I'm planting. If that's not the direction that you should be going in, I'm going to be praying extra hard that you are pushed in that right direction instead of what I'm suggesting. So that's what my prayers for support for you will be.
Thank you.
And all I'd say is offer it up to God and ask Him what He wants you to do with your life. But I feel like there's a lot more to you than what you're currently putting out there in the world. So
I appreciate that, man. And coming on here, man, it's just been an honor. It's been a huge honor to come on here and talk with you. It's honestly like a burden off my shoulders, man. I feel like I've been trying so hard to maybe get all that out. Maybe that's been a thing for me too. And it's an honor to be here and talk with you, man. And I really am going to buy a copy of your book and read this immediately.
I'm going to give you a copy of my book. I'm gonna send you the ebook as soon as we're done talking here.
Okay.
And just read it at your leisure, and then maybe we can have you back on the show and talk about what you thought. Get your opinions on it.
I would love to do that. I would love to.
All right, David, I am going to say it's been about an hour and 15 minutes, and I got a dog downstairs that thought he should have been fed an hour ago. So I'm going to have to say good night to you, or
Yes,
good
sir.
afternoon.
Yeah.
And I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Yeah, man. Me too. All right. We'll see you later.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.